Israel just launched a drone strike in Lebanon's capital city, Beirut, and assassinated a senior Hamas official. This is undoubtedly a major escalation that seems like it's intended to start a wider regional war. This is significant because if Israel launches a full-scale war in Lebanon, they'll be fighting against Hezbollah, the Lebanese political party whose armed wing is significantly larger and better armed than the Palestinian resistance fighters they're fighting in Gaza right now. This wouldn't be the first time Israel's attacked Lebanon either. They've invaded Lebanon twice, both times thinking they would walk away with easy victories, only to be absolutely humiliated, so much so that Lebanon has come to be known as Israel's Vietnam. Here's why. Israel's problems in Lebanon are largely of its own creation and go back to its founding. The state of Israel was conceived as a Jewish-only ethno-state set to be located in Palestine. The obvious problem with this concept being that Palestine was entirely Arab, making the only way to create a Jewish majority in Palestine to ethnically cleanse Palestine of its Arab population and to replace it with Jews from Europe. And this is exactly what they did. The state of Israel was quite literally founded through a years-long campaign of forced expulsion and mass murder, which resulted in 750,000 Palestinians having to flee their homes. Hundreds of thousands of these refugees fled to neighboring Arab countries like Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and of course, Lebanon. Israel launched the Six-Day War in 1967, forcing hundreds of thousands more to flee to neighboring countries. Naturally, these Palestinian refugees weren't just going to accept their own expulsion. Instead, they launched cross-border attacks to try to fight their way back into Palestine. By the 1970s, southern Lebanon became the epicenter of this border war. Historically, the prospect of Palestinians returning to Palestine was and continues to be one of Israel's most central fears. Because if all the Palestinians that Israel's expelled over the last 7 decades returned home, Israel would no longer have a Jewish majority, and it would cease to be a Jewish ethno-state. Israel invades Lebanon in 1982, claiming that it was acting in self-defense, but recently declassified Israeli documents reveal that Israel had already drawn up invasion plans over a year prior. Their goal was to permanently destroy the Palestinian resistance where they were concentrated and install a Christian fascist in power who was friendly to Israel. According to sworn testimony from a former U.S. ambassador to the UN, George Ball, Israel's long-term goal of destroying the Palestinian resistance in Lebanon was to eventually be able to take over the West Bank without opposition and leave only, quote, enough of them for work. Israel quickly surrounds Beirut and installs a leader from the Christian far-right party into the presidency. Palestinian fighters are being evacuated out of Beirut, and for a moment it seems like Israel's won. But a few weeks later, the president is assassinated. Seeking revenge, Israel commits one of its most heinous crimes in its history. Israeli forces surround the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp and allow gunmen from the Christian fascist Phalange party inside the camp to, quote, mop up the camp. Riding in on Israeli vehicles with Israeli weapons in hand, the Phalangists tortured, maimed, sexually abused, and executed what some estimate up to be 2,000 refugees in the Sabra and Shatila camp while Israeli soldiers stood guard outside. Meetings taking place in the lead-up to the massacre show that Israel knew that the Phalangists were going to commit massacres and allowed them in the camp anyway. Israel's attempt to crush the Palestinian resistance through outright slaughter instead gave rise to new resistance groups. These resistance groups carried out bombings and ambushes, killing hundreds of Israeli soldiers. It was so bad that the US had to send Marines into Beirut to try to quell the situation, but the resistance defeated them too. One of the groups that was born out of the resistance to Israel at that moment was Hezbollah, or the Party of God, an Islamic resistance movement inspired by the success of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. By 1985, Israel's occupation of Beirut became untenable, and they pulled their forces back to try to maintain a security zone in southern Lebanon. Their problem was that this happened to be Hezbollah's base of power, where the majority of Lebanon's Shia Muslim community was concentrated. Israel severely underestimated their enemy in the south. Israeli soldiers were fighting an enemy whose language they didn't speak, whose motives they never cared to understand, and who lived among and enjoyed the popular support of the people, meaning there was no indication to Israeli soldiers that a farmer or store owner smiling and waving at you wasn't relaying your location of fighters or plotting to kill you. Even though Israel had better weapons, the Lebanese militants didn't fight the Israelis head-to-head. They used their knowledge of the land to conduct hit-and-run ambushes and sabotage to level the playing field. Much like the Americans in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, Israel assumed that its superior firepower would grant it victory in Lebanon. But what all of these imperialist occupations fail to consider, however, is that killing people and occupying their land only makes them want to fight you more, not less. As Israel desperately poured more money and soldiers into the fight, casualties mounted, and Israel saw no signs of winning. Israeli public opinion began to turn against what was increasingly perceived as an endless stalemate, earning Lebanon the nickname Israel's Vietnam. In 2000, Israel finally surrendered, pulling their forces out under a hail of Lebanese gunfire, ending their 22-year occupation of all of southern Lebanon except for a small strip of farmland called Sheba Farms. This victory made Lebanon the first Arab country to decisively beat Israel militarily. But just 6 years later, Israel would invade Lebanon again, this time to destroy Hezbollah. The immediate cause of the war was that Hezbollah captured 4 Israeli soldiers with the intention of using them to negotiate for the release of Lebanese people imprisoned by Israel, much like Hamas's counteroffensive on October 7th. Israel responded by carpet bombing Lebanon, and much like the response following October 7th, stated that, quote, everything is a legitimate target, not just southern Lebanon, not just the line of Hezbollah posts. A former Israeli army commander explained that Israel's strategy was to indiscriminately bomb Lebanon to drive a rift between the Lebanese people and Hezbollah. In his words, if you want your air conditioning to work, you must take action towards shutting down Hezbollah land. The strategy of using overwhelming force to intentionally destroy civilian infrastructure became a formal Israeli military doctrine, which they called the Dahiyya Doctrine, named after the neighborhood Hezbollah was headquartered in 2006, and the same neighborhood where Israel carried out its drone strike this week. This doctrine guides Israel's current strategy in Gaza today. Bomb everything, make no distinction between civilian and military, and hope people blame the other guy. Again, however, Israel completely underestimated their enemy in 2006. Israel sent in dozens of their most advanced Merkava tanks, dubbed God's chariots, thinking Hezbollah would have no counter for them. Hezbollah, however, created a sophisticated tunnel network that they would pop out of, fire anti-tank guided missiles from, only to then disappear back into the tunnel system, much like what we're seeing in Gaza today. Israel even tried shelling Lebanon by positioning a warship off its coast, only for Hezbollah to severely damage the ship with a Chinese-made anti-ship missile, forcing it to retreat. The turning point of the war was Israel's attack on Bint Jabil, a town in southern Lebanon that served as the heart of Hezbollah's resistance against Israel's first occupation, and the town Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah gave a victory speech in after the Israeli withdrawal. Israel announced that it had complete control of Bint Jabil, only for that narrative to completely fall apart when it became clear that that wasn't true. Hezbollah was able to fend off 3 Israeli attempts at taking the city, despite being outnumbered in their estimates up to 10 or 20 to 1. Israel received its decisive blow at the Battle of Wadi Saluki, where a, quote, few Hezbollah fighters defeated an entire Israeli tank brigade, knocking out over 20 Israeli tanks and even shooting down an Israeli helicopter. Israel withdrew from Lebanon soon after the battle, which has been described as one of the most humiliating operations in the history of the IDF. The supreme arrogance of the imperialists has always been that they begin to believe their own propaganda. Israel's gotten so used to slandering the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance as terrorists, as barbarians, as savages motivated by religious extremism that they seem to have forgotten who they're fighting. They're fighting the descendants of the Nakba. They're fighting the survivors of Sabra and Shatila. They're fighting the now grown-up children of Bint Jabil. In other words, they're fighting the historical memory of their own crimes personified. Israel thinks that bombing Dahiyya in 2024 will be different than bombing Dahiyya in 2006, which they thought would be different from bombing Dahiyya in 1982. So while it's unclear where things will go from here, one way or another, Israel's going to learn that it was never about the size of the bombs they dropped. No bomb was ever going to convince the Lebanese or Palestinian people that they couldn't be free.